On the 15th of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators gathered around the most powerful man in the Roman world and stabbed him to death on the floor of a meeting hall. Julius Caesar, dictator for life, fell with 23 wounds at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey. The men who killed him believed they were saving the Republic from a tyrant, restoring the old order in which no single ruler could dominate the Senate. What they actually created was a vacuum at the heart of the Roman state. Caesar had spent years pulling the machinery of government around himself, sidelining the Senate, rewarding loyal soldiers, and bending traditional offices to his will. With him suddenly gone, no one quite knew who held authority, who commanded the legions stationed across the provinces, or what would happen to the vast network of clients and veterans who had depended on his favor. In the days that followed, Rome held its breath. The assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, expected to be celebrated as liberators, but the crowds in the streets were uneasy rather than grateful. Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, was still consul, still alive, and still in possession of Caesar's papers and personal fortune. An uneasy truce was patched together in the Senate, granting amnesty to the killers while honoring the dead man's acts, but no one believed the arrangement would last. While Rome argued over what to do next, a young man was studying across the Adriatic in the Greek town of Apollonia. He was not yet 20 years old, slight in build and often unwell. His name was Gaius Octavius, and he was Caesar's great-nephew, sent abroad to finish his education and prepare for a quiet career on the edges of public life. News of the assassination reached him by messenger, carried across the sea on a fast ship, and soon after came a second piece of information that changed everything. In his will, Julius Caesar had named the boy his adopted son and principal heir, leaving him the better part of his fortune and, with it, the magic of his name. Overnight, this obscure student became the legal son of the most famous Roman who had ever lived. The reaction among the Roman elite ranged from disbelief to quiet amusement. Caesar had been one of the shrewdest political operators of his age, and many assumed the choice of a sickly teenager as heir was a kind of accident, an arrangement that would unravel the moment the young man tried to act on it. Mark Antony, who had expected to inherit Caesar's political mantle in practice, if not on paper, treated the announcement as a curiosity rather than a threat. The older senators, including the celebrated orator Cicero, saw a useful tool, not a rival. Their assumptions were reasonable and almost entirely wrong. The young heir had no army, no political office, and no record of military command. He had never addressed the Senate, never led a legion, and never managed the finances of a province. Roman politics at this level was a contact sport played by men twice his age, with private fortunes, loyal veterans, and decades of grudges behind them. What he did have was the name. Against the advice of his mother and stepfather, who urged him to refuse the inheritance and stay out of public life, he accepted the adoption and took on the formal style of Gaius Julius Caesar. From that moment, every veteran who had served under the dictator, every freedman who owed his status to the family, and every client across Italy had a reason to listen when he spoke. He set out for Italy with a small group of friends and advisors, with no clear plan beyond claiming his inheritance and testing what the name was worth. The historian Suetonius later wrote that those who knew him in these early months were struck by how calmly he moved through the chaos, as if he had already decided that the Republic, as the senators understood it, was finished. Whether that calm was genuine confidence or carefully studied performance is a question ancient writers themselves could not agree on. What followed was one of the most unlikely political ascents in recorded history. Over the next 13 years, the slight young man, dismissed as a useful pawn, would outmaneuver Mark Antony, isolate the assassins, and dismantle the very republic that the killers of Caesar had died to defend. Arriving in Italy after the assassination, the young heir found a political landscape that no one fully controlled. Mark Antony had seized Caesar's papers and much of his money, and was using both to reward friends and pressure enemies. The Senate watched him with growing unease, suspecting that he intended to step into the dictator's empty place by inches rather than all at once. Into this nervous standoff walked a teenager with a borrowed name and very little else. He began quietly, paying out of his own pocket the cash bequests that Caesar had promised to the citizens of Rome, money that Antony had been holding back. The gesture was small in political terms, but enormous in symbolic weight, because it told every veteran and every poor citizen who had loved the dictator that his true son was the slight young man, not the seasoned consul. Watching all of this from his country estates was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the most respected orator in Rome and a lifelong defender of the old senatorial order. Cicero hated Antony with a personal intensity, viewing him as a drunken brute who would finish what Caesar had started and bury the Republic for good. The young heir, by contrast, looked like a gift, inexperienced, polite in his letters, and apparently grateful for the attention of a famous elder statesman. Cicero's plan was straightforward and, on its own terms, clever. He would lend the boy his enormous prestige in the Senate, push through extraordinary honors and a legitimate military command, and use him as a counterweight against Antony. Once Antony had been broken, the young man could be quietly set aside, his usefulness exhausted, his inexperience exposed. In private letters to a friend, Cicero put the strategy in a phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The young Caesar, he wrote, was to be praised, honored, and lifted up, and then disposed of. The Latin verb he chose carried an unmistakable double meaning, suggesting both political removal and something rather closer to a quiet end. The young heir played the role of grateful student with remarkable patience. He wrote deferential letters, sought Cicero's advice, and allowed the older man to imagine himself the architect of the partnership. Behind that polite correspondence, he was raising private armies from among Caesar's veterans in the Italian countryside, paying them out of his inheritance and the goodwill of his adopted father's name. When fighting broke out between Antony and the Senate's forces near the northern town of Mutina, the young Caesar marched alongside the consuls as a senatorial commander, his irregular legions now stamped with official approval. Antony was defeated and forced to retreat across the Alps, and for a brief moment, Cicero's strategy seemed to be working exactly as designed. The Senate celebrated, voted honors, and began planning the next phase, which involved gently sidelining the young man who had just helped win the war. What the older senators failed to notice was that both consuls had died in the fighting, leaving the surviving legions without senior commanders. The veterans naturally turned to the only Caesar still standing on the battlefield, the 19-year-old who carried the dictator's name and had been paying their wages. He now controlled an army that, on paper, belonged to the Republic, but in practice answered only to him. He sent a delegation of centurions to Rome with a simple request, asking the Senate to grant him the consulship, the highest office in the state, despite his being far below the legal age. The senators, recovering their nerve now that Antony was gone, refused. They had used the boy, won their battle, and saw no reason to hand him the very power they had been trying to prevent Antony from taking. The response was swift and entirely outside the rules of the political game Cicero thought they were playing. He gathered 8 legions and marched them south toward Rome, the first time since the days of Sulla that a Roman army had moved against the capital with the open intention of forcing the Senate's hand. There was no battle because there was no force in the city capable of resisting him. The Senate, faced with armed veterans in the streets, found their objections suddenly less pressing. The young man was elected consul alongside a cousin. The treasury was opened to pay his soldiers, and the laws granting amnesty to Caesar's killers were quietly set aside. In the space of about 18 months, the sickly student from Apollonia had become the legal master of Rome. Cicero, watching his careful strategy collapse, understood what he had helped create. The boy he had planned to discard had used every honor, every command, every senatorial decree as a step on a ladder, and was now standing at the top of it with an army at his back. That outcome rested on a fundamental misreading of the man he had been mentoring. The young Caesar had watched his adoptive father offer pardon after pardon to his enemies, only to be killed by men he had spared. He drew from that example a colder conclusion, that mercy without power was a form of suicide, and that the senators who praised him in public would gladly bury him the moment it became convenient. What Cicero had taken for gratitude was something closer to study. The young man had learned the rhythms of senatorial politics from one of its great masters, absorbed the techniques of persuasion and pressure, and was now preparing to turn them against the very institution Cicero had spent his life defending. The march on Rome was not the end of the story, but its true beginning, because the new consul had no intention of governing alone for long. Far to the north, Antony was rebuilding his forces with the help of other Caesarian commanders who had no love for the Senate. The two men who had spent the previous year trying to destroy each other were about to discover that they shared a more useful enemy, and that the assassins of Julius Caesar were still alive, still wealthy, and still in command of the eastern provinces. The young consul did not stay in Rome long after his election. Within weeks of forcing the Senate to recognize his command, he was moving north again, this time not to fight Mark Antony, but to meet him. The two enemies, separated by armed legions and a great deal of public hatred, arranged a conference on a small island in a river near the town of Bononia, in northern Italy. They were joined there by a third commander, Marcus Lepidus, an older Caesarian general who controlled important provinces in Gaul and Spain. Lepidus brought legions and respectability, and just as importantly, he brought a willingness to be the junior partner in an arrangement that the other two were already shaping between them. For 3 days the men talked in private, while their soldiers watched from opposite banks of the river. What they produced was a formal agreement, ratified soon afterwards by a compliant assembly in Rome, that gave the three of them dictatorial powers for 5 years. They called themselves the Triumvirate for the Ordering of the Republic, a title that sounded almost administrative. In practice, they had divided the Roman world among themselves and suspended the ordinary workings of law, election, and senatorial debate. Their first major act was a program of organized killing that the Romans called proscription. Lists of names were posted in the forum, hundreds at first, and eventually around 2,000, naming senators and wealthy equestrians who were to be hunted down and executed without trial. Their property would be confiscated, their heirs disinherited, and rewards paid to anyone, slave or free, who brought in a head. The official justification was security, the elimination of enemies who might rise against the new regime. The actual purpose was at least as much financial, because the triumvirs had armies to pay and no easy way to raise the necessary cash. By turning the richest men in Italy into targets, they could fund their legions and remove potential opponents in a single stroke. Each of the three contributed names to the lists, and each accepted the deaths of his own relatives and friends as the price of the other's cooperation. Lepidus agreed to the killing of his brother, Antony to the death of an uncle, and the young Caesar to the execution of men who had supported him only months before. The historian Appian described the scenes in Rome with unusual restraint, noting that fathers were betrayed by sons and husbands by wives, often for a share of the reward money. The most famous name on the lists belonged to Cicero. Antony had hated him for years, ever since the orator had delivered a series of furious speeches denouncing him as a public enemy, and he demanded Cicero's death as a non-negotiable condition of the alliance. The young Caesar, who owed his early career to Cicero's patronage, reportedly resisted for 2 days before agreeing. Soldiers caught the old orator near his country estate as he was trying to escape by sea. According to Plutarch, Cicero leaned out of his litter, offered his neck to the sword, and was killed without resistance. His head and hands were carried back to Rome and nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum, the same platform from which he had delivered the speeches that condemned him. It is tempting to see this moment as the murder of the Roman Republic, the killing of its greatest defender by men who had no use for its traditions. The reality is considerably more complicated, because the republic that Cicero had defended was already a battered and violent institution by the time the triumvirs put his name on their list. For nearly a century before the proscriptions, Roman politics had been drifting toward exactly this kind of organized killing. The dictator Sulla had posted similar lists a generation earlier, executing thousands of his opponents and confiscating their estates to reward his soldiers. Street violence between rival political gangs had been a regular feature of Roman life for decades, with elections decided as often by clubs and knives as by votes. Provincial governors routinely stripped their territories for personal profit, and the wealth gap between the senatorial aristocracy and ordinary citizens had grown into something closer to a chasm. The Senate that mourned Cicero was the same body that had voted special commands to ambitious generals, declared its own members public enemies, and stood by while political opponents were beaten to death in the streets. In form, the Republic was a system of shared power among elected magistrates, but in practice, it had become an oligarchy in which a few dozen families competed for offices, armies, and provincial loot. This matters for understanding what the triumvirs were actually doing. They were not destroying a peaceful constitutional order, because no such order existed by the time they came to power. They were bringing into the open, and on a larger scale, the warlord politics that had been corroding the Republic for generations, finishing a process that men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar had each advanced in their turn. That is not a defense of the prescriptions, which were monstrous by any standard and were understood as such even at the time. The choice facing Romans was not between the triumvirs and a healthy republic, but between competing groups of armed men, each claiming to act for the state while pursuing their own survival and enrichment. Cicero himself had defended summary executions when they served his side, during the suppression of a conspiracy led by the senator Catiline. The young Caesar, just 20 years old, signed his name to lists that condemned men he had dined with. Whether he did so with reluctance or with cold calculation is impossible to know, because the surviving accounts were written long after the fact by authors with their own agendas. What is clear is that he understood the political logic of the killings, accepted it, and would later try to bury the memory of his participation beneath decades of careful image-making. With the prescriptions complete and the treasury refilled with confiscated wealth, the triumvirs turned their attention east. The assassins of Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius had spent the previous 2 years gathering legions in Greece and the eastern provinces, raising taxes and building an army that they hoped would restore the old republic by force. The young Caesar and Antony, temporarily united by shared interest, prepared to cross the Adriatic and finish the war that had begun on the floor of the Senate. The campaign in Greece against the assassins ended in 2 hard-fought battles near the town of Philippi, where Brutus and Cassius were defeated and took their own lives. The victory left the Roman world divided among the surviving triumvirs, with the young Caesar holding Italy and the West, Antony taking the wealthy eastern provinces, and Lepidus reduced to a junior share in North Africa. On paper, the arrangement was a partnership, but in practice, it was a slow countdown to the next civil war. Antony settled into the east as something close to a Hellenistic monarch, drawing on the resources of the client kingdoms and forming a long political and personal alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. She controlled the richest grain supply in the Mediterranean and a treasury that could fund armies on a scale Italy could not match, and Antony needed both for his planned invasion of the Parthian Empire. The relationship produced children, public ceremonies, and grants of territory to Cleopatra's family that were entirely defensible by the standards of Roman provincial politics, but were politically explosive when reported back in Rome. The young Caesar understood this better than Antony did. While his colleague campaigned in the deserts of the east, suffered a costly defeat against the Parthians, and grew steadily more dependent on Egyptian money, the man in Italy was working on something less glamorous but more durable. He was building a reputation as the defender of Roman tradition, Italian soil, and old-fashioned virtue against the corrupting influence of Eastern luxury. The contrast was largely manufactured. The young Caesar's own behavior during these years was not noticeably more restrained than Antony's. He had set aside one wife to marry another for political advantage, conducted affairs that were openly discussed, and ruled Italy through a combination of confiscations and military threat. What he possessed, and Antony lacked, was a sharp instinct for how stories traveled and which images stuck in the public mind. Coins minted in his territories carried images of traditional Roman gods and symbols of civic virtue, while rumors from the East, encouraged by his agents, described Antony reclining on golden couches, wearing Eastern dress, and allowing Cleopatra to address him as her king. Whether these reports were accurate hardly mattered, because they fit a pattern that ordinary Romans already half believed about the dangers of the East. He was not inventing prejudices so much as harvesting them. The decisive moment in this long campaign came when he learned that Antony had deposited his will with the Vestal Virgins in Rome, the priestesses who traditionally guarded such documents as a matter of sacred trust. He demanded that the Vestals hand it over, and when they refused, he went to the temple himself and took it by force. The act was a serious violation of religious law, and his own supporters in the Senate were uneasy about it. He read selected passages aloud to the Senate and to public gatherings, focusing on the sections that would do the most damage. Antony, the will allegedly stated, wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome, and acknowledged her children as his heirs to substantial territories. Modern historians have raised serious doubts about whether the will was genuine, whether it had been read accurately, or whether the most damaging passages had simply been forged outright. The political effect, however, was exactly what he wanted. A Roman who wished to be buried in a foreign capital had, in the eyes of his fellow citizens, ceased to be properly Roman, and a general who treated a foreign queen as the mother of his legitimate heirs was no longer fit to command Roman soldiers. Within weeks, the Senate stripped Antony of his offices and declared war, carefully framing the conflict as a war against Cleopatra rather than against a fellow Roman, which allowed Italians to fight without the stain of civil bloodshed. The military campaign that followed has often been remembered as the young Caesar's personal triumph, the moment when the political operator proved himself a battlefield commander as well. The reality is considerably less flattering to his reputation. The actual fighting, the planning, and the decisive maneuvers were directed by his closest friend and the finest Roman admiral of the generation, Marcus Agrippa. Agrippa had been at his side since their student days, and had spent the previous years rebuilding the Roman navy into a force capable of taking on Antony's larger fleet. He developed new boarding weapons, trained crews in fresh tactics, and won an earlier sea war against the son of Pompey in the waters off Sicily, a victory that had quietly secured Italy's grain supply. Without Agrippa, the young Caesar would have had no fleet worth the name. The two forces met off the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium, where Antony's fleet had been bottled up by Agrippa's blockade and his own logistical failures. Antony's men were suffering from disease and desertion. His supply lines had been cut by smaller and more maneuverable ships, and his attempt to break out into open water turned into a confused running battle rather than a decisive engagement. Cleopatra's squadron withdrew toward Egypt. Antony followed, and the rest of his fleet either surrendered or was destroyed. The young Caesar was present, but surviving accounts made clear that the tactical direction belonged to Agrippa from beginning to end. What the commander-in-chief contributed was something different and, in its own way, equally important. He had created the political conditions in which the battle could be fought as a defense of Rome against a foreign queen, and he ensured that the victory would be remembered as his personal achievement rather than his admiral's. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where they held out for nearly a year before taking their own lives as the victorious legions approached. Egypt was annexed as a personal possession of the conqueror rather than a senatorial province, and its enormous wealth flowed into his hands alone. At the age of 32, the young man who had arrived in Italy with a borrowed name was now the sole master of the Roman world, with no rival left standing and no army outside his control. The problem facing the young master of Rome in the months after his return from Egypt was, in its essentials, the same problem that had killed his adoptive father. Julius Caesar had taken sole power openly, accepted titles that smelled of monarchy, and was cut down on the floor of the Senate by men who claimed to be defending the Republic. The lesson was not that absolute power was impossible, but that it had to be wrapped in language and forms that did not provoke the same reaction. He had the practical means of control already in hand. His personal wealth, swollen by the confiscated treasury of Egypt, was larger than the public revenue of the Roman state, and he could pay legions out of his own pocket without asking the Senate for anything. The provinces that mattered militarily were full of soldiers who had sworn personal loyalty to him, and the city of Rome itself had grown used to his presence as the only credible source of order after 20 years of civil war. What he lacked was a vocabulary. Calling himself dictator was politically impossible, because the title had been abolished by formal vote after Caesar's murder and carried associations no one in his position could afford. Calling himself king was worse still, because the Romans had been telling themselves for nearly 5 centuries that they had expelled their last king and would never accept another. The solution, worked out carefully with his closest advisors over several years, was presented to the Senate in a famous session in late January of 27, before the Common Era. He rose before the assembled senators and announced that the emergency was over, that the civil wars had ended, and that he was returning all of his extraordinary powers to the Senate and the Roman people. The Republic, he declared, was restored. The performance was carefully prepared, and the response had been equally carefully arranged in advance. Senators rose to beg him not to abandon the state in its hour of need, and after suitable hesitation, he agreed to accept a more limited package of responsibilities for the good of Rome. What he actually accepted was command over the provinces where almost all the legions were stationed, including Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt. The provinces he generously returned to senatorial administration were the peaceful ones, the old territories around the Mediterranean where no significant military force was needed. In legal terms, he was simply a proconsul with an unusually large command, exercising a kind of authority that ambitious Romans had held many times before. In practical terms, he commanded almost every soldier in the Roman world, while his colleagues in the Senate governed places where there was nothing to command. A few days later, the Senate voted him a new name, one his propagandists had clearly suggested in advance. He would be called Augustus, a word with religious overtones suggesting someone enlarged by divine favor, without carrying any of the constitutional baggage of dictator or king. The name placed him in a category of his own, above ordinary magistrates, but outside the formal hierarchy that had killed his father. The settlement was a structure of overlapping fictions, held together by a single underlying reality. Augustus held no office that had not existed before, exercised no power that earlier Romans had not exercised in some form, and could point to legal precedent for every individual element of his position. The combination, however, was something new, because no one before him had ever held all of these traditional authorities simultaneously for an indefinite period, while also commanding the personal loyalty of the army and the wealth of Egypt. A second settlement, worked out about 4 years later, refined the arrangement further. He gave up his annual consulship which had been creating friction with ambitious senators who wanted their turn in the office, and accepted instead the powers of a tribune of the people, the ancient magistracy that protected ordinary Romans against aristocratic abuse. The tribunician power allowed him to propose laws, veto the actions of other officials, and claim the sacred inviolability that traditionally protected tribunes from physical harm. He also accepted a grant of greater proconsular authority that placed his command above that of any other provincial governor, allowing him to overrule them without holding any of their offices himself. Each piece could be defended as traditional because tribunes and proconsuls had existed for centuries. The novelty lay in holding both at once, permanently, in combination with the moral authority of the new name and the practical authority of the army. Modern historians sometimes call the system the Principate, from the Latin princeps, meaning first citizen or leading man, which Augustus preferred to any more grandiose title. He was, in the official language of his regime, simply the first among equals in a restored republic, a private citizen who happened to hold a few traditional offices and whose advice the Senate found useful. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates continued to be elected, and the formal machinery of the old constitution kept running with apparent normality. Behind the machinery, every important decision flowed from his household. Appointments to senior commands, the management of the treasury, the disposition of the legions, the conduct of foreign policy, and the supply of grain to the city all depended on his personal judgment or that of his closest advisers. Senators who understood the new rules could still have rewarding careers, but only by accepting that their advancement depended on the favor of one man. His own account of his reign, inscribed on bronze tablets and copied across the empire after his death, captured the official version with careful precision. He had, he wrote, transferred the republic from his own power back to the authority of the Senate and the Roman people, and although he had surpassed everyone in influence, he had held no more legal authority than his colleagues in any given office. The statement was true in every specific detail and entirely misleading as a description of how Rome was actually governed. The genius of the arrangement was that it gave almost everyone a reason to accept it. Ordinary Romans got peace, regular grain, and an end to the civil wars that had defined their lifetimes. Soldiers got reliable pay and land when they retired. Senators kept their titles, their dignity, and the possibility of meaningful careers, provided they did not push too hard against the limits of the new order. The young man who had once signed prescription lists had found a way to hold absolute power without ever having to admit that he held it. The new political settlement gave Augustus a legal framework for permanent rule, but legal frameworks on their own do not change how people think about their rulers. A man who has just ended a century of civil war by absorbing every important office into his own household needs more than tribunician powers and proconsular grants to make the arrangement feel natural. He needs the Romans themselves to believe that what has happened was not a quiet revolution, but a return to something older, purer, and somehow more truly Roman than what came before. The task of producing this belief was handed, in large part, to a small circle of cultivated friends who understood how stories shape political reality. The most important of them was a wealthy Etruscan named Gaius Maecenas, a man of refined taste and considerable wealth who held no formal office and seemed to want none. His role was harder to describe than that of a minister or a magistrate, because what he did was cultivate the writers and artists whose work would define how the new regime was understood by educated Romans and by everyone who came after. Maecenas gathered around himself the finest poets of the generation, offered them patronage, country estates, and access to the inner circle of the regime, and gently encouraged them to write the kind of work that supported the new order without being so crude as to look like propaganda. The poets in question were not hacks, which is precisely why the strategy worked. Horace, Propertius, and above all Virgil were genuinely talented writers whose voluntary alignment with the regime carried a credibility that no paid flatterer could have produced. Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid, was the most important single contribution to the project. The poem told the story of a Trojan prince named Aeneas, who, after the fall of Troy, wandered the Mediterranean and eventually settled in Italy, where his descendants would found Rome. Embedded in the narrative were prophecies that pointed directly at Augustus as the fulfillment of a destiny stretching back more than 1,000 years, the figure for whom all of Roman history had been a preparation. In one famous passage, the father of Aeneas speaks from the underworld and describes the future ruler who will bring back the age of gold to the fields where the god Saturn once reigned. The lines were unmistakably about Augustus, and they framed his rule not as the outcome of recent civil war, but as the completion of a divine plan. The Roman who read or heard the poem was being invited to understand the present, not as the result of armies and confiscations, but as the working out of fate. Horace contributed in a different register, producing odes that celebrated Roman traditional virtues, criticized Eastern luxury, and praised the new peace in language that drew on the oldest religious vocabulary of the Roman state. Propertius, less obviously political, wove references to Augustus and his victories into love poetry that reached audiences who would have rolled their eyes at anything more direct. The combined effect was a literary culture in which support for the regime felt like good taste rather than political compliance. The same strategy was carried out in stone and marble across the city. Augustus famously boasted, in the account of his reign he left for posterity, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and the claim was largely accurate. His building program transformed the physical appearance of the capital on a scale not seen for centuries. New temples rose across the city, old ones were restored, and the Forum was redesigned around a vast new complex that placed his adoptive father, the deified Julius Caesar, at the symbolic center of Roman religious life. A temple to Mars the Avenger commemorated the defeat of Caesar's assassins and tied military victory to family piety. The altar of Augustan peace, erected on the field of Mars, depicted the imperial family in solemn procession alongside priests and senators, presenting them as the natural focus of Roman religious observance. The visual program worked because it did not look like innovation. The temples used traditional forms, the religious rituals followed ancient precedents, and the artistic style consciously borrowed from the classical Greek tradition that educated Romans associated with cultural seriousness. A visitor walking through the new Rome saw not the monuments of a revolutionary regime, but a city that seemed to have rediscovered its own oldest values, with the household of Augustus quietly placed at the center of every important sightline. Religion provided the final and most powerful element of the project. Augustus took the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, after the death of the previous holder, and used the position to revive old cults, restore neglected ceremonies, and weave his own family into the calendar of public worship. The month of his birth was renamed in his honor, and the genius, or guardian spirit, of Augustus himself began to receive offerings alongside the traditional household gods of ordinary Romans. In the eastern provinces, where ruler cult was an old and uncontroversial tradition, temples to Augustus were built openly, and worship of him as a living god proceeded without difficulty. In Italy and the West, where such directness would have offended Roman sensibilities, the cult was managed more carefully, focusing on his genius rather than his person and pairing his worship with that of the goddess Roma. The careful gradation by region showed how well the regime understood its own audience. Modern historians have sometimes been tempted to describe this whole effort as cynical manipulation, a cold-blooded campaign to disguise tyranny as tradition. The description captures part of the truth, but misses something important. Many of the writers, artists, and priests who participated genuinely believed in what they were producing, because the alternative they remembered was decades of civil war, proscription, and uncertainty, and they were not wrong to see the new settlement as a real improvement. What Augustus had accomplished was the construction of a cultural and religious framework in which his personal rule no longer felt like an imposition. The marble city, the great epic, the restored temples, and the careful integration of his family into Roman public religion together produced a version of reality in which submission to one man was indistinguishable from loyalty to ancient tradition. The political revolution had been completed not in the Senate, but in the imagination of the Roman people, and the new shape of power was now woven into the texture of everyday life. The man who had rebuilt Rome in marble and woven his family into the religious life of the state had every reason to expect that the same family would carry his work forward. He had a daughter, Julia, born to his second wife, and through her he hoped to produce grandsons who would inherit the system he had spent his life constructing. The personal arithmetic of dynastic succession, however, proved far less obedient to his will than the senators and provinces he had mastered. Augustus had married Julia's mother briefly and divorced her almost immediately after the child's birth, a piece of political tidying that allowed him to marry Livia Drusilla, the woman who would remain at his side for the rest of his life. Livia brought 2 sons from a previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus, but produced no children with Augustus, despite years of trying. The lack of a son of his own blood was the first great frustration of the dynastic project, because it meant that any successor would have to come through his daughter or through adoption. Julia was raised in a household of austere discipline, taught to spin wool like the matrons of old Rome, and kept under close supervision. She was also, from a very young age, a political asset whose marriages were arranged with the cold precision of treaty negotiations. Her first husband was her cousin Marcellus, a promising young man whom Augustus appeared to be grooming as a successor, and whose early death from illness was the first in a long series of dynastic disasters. After Marcellus, Julia was married to Agrippa, the loyal admiral who had won Actium and built much of the new Rome. The match was politically perfect and personally strange, because Agrippa was old enough to be her father and had to divorce his own wife to accept the assignment. From this union came the grandsons Augustus had wanted, including 2 boys named Gaius and Lucius, whom he formally adopted and began advancing through public office at an unusually young age. The plan seemed at last to be working, with 2 healthy heirs in training and Agrippa to guide them. Then Agrippa died, and Augustus was forced to find Julia a 3rd husband from within the household. The choice fell on his stepson Tiberius, who was compelled to divorce a wife he genuinely loved in order to marry a woman he reportedly came to despise, beginning a union that satisfied no one and produced lasting bitterness on every side. While managing these arrangements, Augustus was also legislating sweeping moral reforms for the rest of Rome. New laws penalized adultery, rewarded marriage and childbearing among the senatorial class, and treated the sexual conduct of women, in particular, as a matter of public concern enforceable by the courts. The laws were presented as a restoration of ancestral virtue, a return to the stern morality that had supposedly made Rome great before the corruptions of recent wealth. The contradiction at the heart of this legislation would soon become humiliatingly public. Julia, raised in her father's disciplined household and married off 3 times for reasons of state, conducted her private life according to standards that bore no relation to her father's laws. Reports reached Augustus of nighttime gatherings in the Forum, of lovers drawn from the most prominent families, and of behavior that made a mockery of the moral program he had attached his name to. When the evidence could no longer be ignored, he reacted with the fury of a man whose public position and private wound coincided exactly. He denounced Julia before the Senate in a letter read aloud to the assembled body, exiled her to a tiny island off the coast of Italy, and forbade her wine and the company of men. Several of her alleged lovers were exiled or driven to suicide, and one of them, a son of Mark Antony, was executed in a punishment that carried unmistakable political overtones. Ancient sources hint that the affair may have involved a conspiracy against Augustus himself, but the truth has never been fully recoverable. What is clear is that he never forgave her, never allowed her to return, and reportedly said of Julia and her equally disgraced daughter that they were 2 cancers in his flesh. The man who had made the restoration of Roman family values a centerpiece of his reign had publicly destroyed his own family in the process. The dynastic catastrophes continued. Lucius died of illness while traveling to take up a military command, and Gaius died not long after from a wound that turned septic during a campaign in the east, leaving Augustus without the grandsons he had spent years preparing. Every careful arrangement had been undone by disease, accident, and the simple unpredictability of human mortality. He was left with options he had never wanted. A 3rd grandson, Agrippa Postumus, born after his father's death, proved violent and unstable and was eventually exiled. That left Tiberius, the stepson Augustus had never genuinely preferred. A capable general, but a withdrawn and resentful man whose relationship with the family had been poisoned by forced marriages and dynastic disappointment, Tiberius had spent several years in self-imposed exile on the island of Rhodes. He had reportedly been exhausted by his impossible marriage to Julia and his subordinate position in the succession behind her sons. Only after the deaths of Gaius and Lucius was he recalled, adopted by Augustus, and placed in line for the supreme position he had once been passed over for. The man who would inherit the empire did so as a 4th choice, after a nephew, a friend, and 2 grandsons had all died before him. The private cost of the dynastic project had been almost total. Augustus had outlived his preferred heirs, exiled his only child, broken his stepson's first marriage, and produced no clear successor through his own blood. The household that the altar of peace had presented as the serene center of Roman religious life was, by the final years of his reign, a place of empty rooms, bitter memories, and a single brooding figure being prepared against everyone's earlier preference to inherit the work of a lifetime. The republic that Augustus claimed to have restored had in fact been quietly buried, and by the time he died, almost no one remembered clearly how it had once worked. The senators who had served under the old system were nearly all gone, replaced by men whose entire political careers had unfolded under his shadow. For the generation now reaching maturity, the idea of consuls competing for genuine power, of armies loyal to the state rather than to a single commander, of provinces governed by genuinely independent magistrates, had become a kind of historical rumor rather than a living memory. What Romans had received in exchange for this loss was something they valued enormously, which is why the bargain held. The civil wars that had begun with the murder of Tiberius Gracchus more than a century earlier and continued through the rivalries of Marius and Sulla, the conquests of Pompey and Caesar, and the long duel between Antony and Octavius had finally come to an end. Children were being born who would grow up never seeing a Roman army march against another Roman army, and to their parents, this was something close to a miracle. The peace was real, and it was vast. Trade moved freely from Spain to Syria, along roads that were maintained and seas policed against pirates. Cities across the empire built theatres, aqueducts, and forums in the confident expectation that no army would come to burn them down. Egyptian grain reached Rome on a reliable schedule. The legions stayed on the frontiers rather than fighting one another in Italy, and the basic infrastructure of civilized life was extended to provinces that had known only intermittent order before. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it would last in recognizable form for roughly 2 centuries. Historians have argued ever since about how to weigh it against what was lost, because the gains were as concrete as the losses were abstract. A peasant in Gaul, or a merchant in Asia Minor, cared very little about the formal independence of the Roman Senate, and cared a great deal about whether his harvest would be burned or his shop looted by passing soldiers. The deeper lesson of the reign is harder to state, without sounding either cynical or naive. What Augustus had understood, and what his rivals had not, was that after enough years of chaos, ordinary people will trade almost any amount of political liberty for the simple promise that the violence will stop. The Republic had not been destroyed by a single coup or a single dictator, but by the accumulated exhaustion of citizens who had concluded that the old freedoms were no longer worth the price of constant war. The Romans did not, on the whole, feel that they had been enslaved. Many felt that they had been rescued, and the writers and artists who praised the new order were not all lying when they did so. The grim truth embedded in this acceptance is one that later ages have rediscovered many times. The surrender of self-government rarely happens through dramatic confrontation. It happens through the quieter calculation that stability is worth more than participation, and that someone else can be trusted to make the difficult decisions. Augustus had also done something that would outlast him by many centuries. He had designed a working model of executive power that disguised itself as something more modest, a system in which one person held overwhelming authority, while the older institutions continued to meet, to vote, and to issue documents in their traditional forms. The Senate still gathered, laws were still passed in the ancient language of the Roman people, and magistrates still wore the robes their ancestors had worn, even as every important decision was made elsewhere. This template of authoritarian substance, wrapped in constitutional appearance, proved remarkably durable. His immediate successors inherited it more or less intact, and the emperors who followed for the next 3 centuries governed through variations of the same basic arrangement. Beyond Rome itself, the pattern would be studied and imitated by rulers across many later centuries, who recognized in it a solution to a problem that recurred whenever a society outgrew its older political forms. The man who built this system had lived long enough to see almost all of his original companions die before him. Agrippa, Maecenas, his sister Octavia, his preferred grandsons, and most of the friends of his youth were gone by the time he reached his final years. He died at 75 in a small town in Campania, reportedly asking those around his bed whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, a line borrowed from Greek theatre that suggested he understood his own reign as a kind of performance. By any measure, he would have recognized the performance had been extraordinarily successful. He had taken power as a teenager, whose only real asset was a name borrowed from his murdered great-uncle, survived the proscriptions and the civil wars, defeated every rival who stood against him, and ruled for more than 4 decades without ever facing a serious revolt. The empire he left behind was larger, more peaceful, and more administratively coherent than anything the Republic had managed during its centuries of expansion. The cost of this achievement is the part of the story that requires the steadiest gaze. Tens of thousands had died in the proscriptions, on the battlefields of Philippi and Actium, and in the smaller wars of consolidation that followed. The political culture of the Roman elite, which had produced figures like Cicero and Cato through centuries of genuine competition, had been replaced by a culture of careful flattery in which advancement depended on the favor of a single household. His own daughter had been exiled, his stepson coerced into a hated marriage, and the family that the altar of peace had celebrated as the calm center of Roman religion had been hollowed out by his own decisions. Whether the bargain was worth it depended, then as now, on where one stood. A farmer in Italy who lived out a long life without ever seeing a Roman army on the march would have answered one way. A senator who remembered the old freedoms of debate and election would have answered another, and a daughter exiled to a barren island for the sake of a moral program she had never been consulted about would have answered a third. The boy, from a respectable but unremarkable family, had become the model of what a ruler could be when intelligence, patience, and a clear-eyed willingness to use violence were combined with a genuine talent for making the resulting power look like something else. The republic he claimed to have restored was gone. The empire that replaced it would shape the Mediterranean world for centuries, and the pattern he had set would echo through the political imagination of every age that came after his own. That pattern is still with us, the quiet exchange of freedom for order, repeated whenever people grow tired enough of chaos. If you lived through those decades of civil war, watched your neighbors die in someone else's power struggle, and then a man offered you peace at the price of never really choosing your leaders again, would you have taken the bargain or held out for something better that might never come? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.